I'm just so thrilled to see everyone here and welcome my dear friend, Dianne Gray. Dianne Gray is the CEO of Hospice and Healthcare Communications Company, an author, advocate, and grief and end-of-life care expert. She's a global keynote speaker, author of hundreds of articles, textbook chapters, TV radio host and guest, and president of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. She's an amazing person. She is a go-to for difficult conversations. I don't know who you can say that about in your life. We've certainly had many of those. Dianne, it is such a pleasure and an honor to welcome you here to the Choose Love webinar tonight. Thank you. Thanks, Scarlett. I don't know if we can split screen or how you guys are doing this, but you know, the net of, you know, the work that I do is I have, yes, I help people die, but I also help them through their grief journey. Student of life. Yeah, my background is in sports medicine and sports management, studied neurology. From there, got married and had a child who had a rare disease and became a caregiver as I was pregnant with my second child. And long story short, Austin ended up with a rare 1 in a million disease. And from there, my daughter also became a grieving child as she watched her brother, you know, get ready to die for 10 years. Not an easy time. I apologize for the reflection over here. I can adjust that in a minute. I live in this cavernous sort of space right here. So it's not so easy. If you'll give me just a nanosecond to step back, I'll move that ring right here. The gist of what I want to share with you is this presentation tonight, it's not me talking, it's us talking. Grief is universal. And I'm a part of the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. I've been on the board of directors for 13 years. I do these talks all over the world, including Hawaii at the base, at the Joint Base. I speak at schools, churches, association meetings, I'll do keynotes, etc. And the whole conversation is not that grief is, not only that grief is universal, but it's a participatory process. We have choice. We have the opportunity to kind of work in conjunction with the science and spirit if you're so oriented. So science and research have taught us some amazing things about grief and grieving. I know from my own background that with my son, when he was seriously ill, I got to the point where he was in pain in cycles of 4 hours. And I decided I better figure out how to do it because the pain wasn't going away. And I needed to figure out how to manage it. And when we got through the process and Austin had died and I was at his funeral, and I was thinking about you guys as teachers. First of all, many of you, though not all, I thought about what you must feel or what you might feel right now. And what you might feel is this sense of helplessness because other people create the policies, other people create the structure, other people create the trauma. And yet I went back to this conversation that my pastor at my church had with me, and he gave this as part of the eulogy for my son. And what he said is that Austin, my son, who had this rare neurodegenerative disease, was helpless because he couldn't move the last 5 years of his life. He was helpless, but he was not powerless. And I thought about that for tonight. And I thought about the fact that in these situations, many times we feel helpless to prevent death. Even in our own families, our mothers, our lives are still going on. People still get divorces. People still, you know, have financial strife and issues, and they still have their parents die. Meanwhile, we have all these other issues that are going on in the schools. And I realized that we are not powerless. And I also realized that if we're feeling this way, What are the children feeling? And when I do go to the schools and I sit in the classroom, sometimes I'll sit in my jeans and I'll sit in the corner, and all I do is I just watch. I watch the conversation, because I do copious amounts of research on communication in end of life and death, communication in the grief space, communication between teachers and children, children and parents. Where do we go? What do we do? How do we say it? What's our tone? All kinds of things. And it's really quite fascinating, because there's a perception that we are powerless. And that is just not true. It's not true. We can choose what conversations to have. We can choose different outcomes. We cannot choose a long list of other things, but it's personal. It's personal to me. This is very personal to me. I have 2 kids in school, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. They're my grandkids. And I was driving down the street the other day, and there were gunshots that went past my car with my golden retriever in my car. And by the way, if you hear any noise, that's the dog child in the background. I apologize in advance. But the net of it is, this is personal, and it's personal to all of us. So I'm going to start my presentation. It's interactive. I'm going to try and see your questions on the side. Okay, as I go on and start doing my thing. But we're going to have a copious, big Q&A afterward. When I do this, I share research, but I also share stories. It's very personal. This is a sacred space. What you say here is not for anybody else. Okay, this is our deal, and the chat is ours. So I'm going to move that ring light for just a second, because it's distracting, I'm sure. And then we're going to start our PowerPoint. But please write in the chat box as we go along. I'm going to open it up.
We'll have access to the recording. And Dianne, while you go do that, I'll just say that, I learned a lot about the grieving process and what we know about grief following the Sandy Hook tragedy, when my son went back to school. And, what's interesting is that no one ever mentioned Jesse's name. He went from 7th to 12th grade, and no one ever asked him how he was, because they were afraid that they might trigger or remind. And what I realized is there was a lot of fear around grief. And what Dianne taught me was that grieving is a natural process, and we grieve every day. We grieve the loss of things. It could be the loss of an opportunity that we had. We're all grieving through the losses that we all incurred through COVID, whether it was a loss of freedom, the loss of being able to see other people, or a major loss of a loved one. But grief is such a natural process, and there is a lot of fear around it. And what we wanted to do was de-escalate the fear so that we could just embrace something that happens, and that's actually part of a healing process as well, a healing and growing process.
It's so true. It's a very natural part of life, and yet we, the big we, mistakenly think that grief is part of a disorder, which on its own, grief is not. Let me ask you a question real quick, and I'm going to switch to our presentation and get started. And just let you know, we're going to have slides, and then a conversation, and then Q&A. Can you guys pop your questions? What do you want to hear about tonight? And that's going to help me drive the message to you guys that are here. What do you want to know about? What do you want to hear? What's your area of concern? And I can try and go in that direction. Does that sound good? Most of all, thank you for being here. All right. How do we help others, especially children, process grief in a way to help them grow? Love it. We also teach them about post-traumatic growth. And Dawn, if you can do me a favor and keep that question in your head and type it back in there in a little bit. Let's talk about post-traumatic growth. Okay. So first of all, we're going to talk about helping children help other children. And the reason that we are going to talk about that, thanks, Stuart. The reason that we're going to talk about this is exactly what I said before. When my son was dying, we had children in and out of our house all the time. That was just my jam. That was how we lived. And it was a really special time. And the children would come in and they felt helpless because they couldn't help prevent death and they couldn't help prevent their own grief. But what we discovered is that by empowering them to have conversations, it made them understand that they were far from powerless. And with that, all of them began to bloom as a group. So here's something that I live by, and I'm so grateful to you all for being here. You know, this concept that I can't do anything, what's the right thing for me to do? It doesn't make a difference what I do. Everybody's grieving. There's so much grief, blah, blah, blah. Edward Everett Hale said this: I am but one. I cannot do everything, but I can do something. Everything starts with one. Choose Love movement started with Scarlett. One person. One person. In your world, your message starts with you. However, we know from the National Association of Children's Grief that the children experiencing grief is just, the numbers are profound. And I'm going to ask you to not do too deep of a dive on this slide because I swear it will depress everyone immediately. Here are the numbers from 2021-ish. 1 in 12 children in the US will experience the death of a parent or sibling by age 18. It more than doubles to 14.7 million by the age of 25. That was 2021. That also doesn't take into account grief due to divorce, parental alienation, pet loss, et cetera, loss of a home due to nature, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, disasters, etc. The numbers are staggering. And I don't mean to daunt you with the numbers. I think we all kind of sort of imagine what that number might be, but it's important to know that 14.7 million young adults and children in our country, this was in 2021, will be bereaved by the age of 25. If you look at Judy's House, and by the way, I don't know how many of you know about Judy's House, but it is an extraordinary research-based organization that has all kinds of tools on childhood bereavement and estimation. So they put the number of children newly bereaved each day due to death of a parent or sibling in 2021 was 1192 in our country. Staggering. 1,192 kids in our country lost a parent or a sibling every day. So we need to sort of shift our conversation. But with that said, we can't completely shift it because you guys as teachers have metrics and testing and all of the other things that you're doing. And on top of it, many of you as instructors are now, I hate to say this, but I feel it's true, co-parenting in a sense. Do you feel that way? If you're an instructor on here, will you type in yes or no? You know, do you feel that you're being asked to more or less sometimes provide parenting skills that are mind-bending? So with that said, I geared this presentation to you. Here's the net: tragedy, trauma, and the brain. So regardless of how emotional trauma or stress arrives, the brain handles it using similar processes. In our country, and in the world in general, but especially our country, we seem to have this this sort of predisposition toward, okay, go to grief therapy and just talk about it, without ever understanding that this is not just something to just talk about. We need to understand what stress and trauma and grief do to the brain. And once we understand what it does to the brain, we're going to understand why it is so darn difficult for kids to learn in school when they're grieving. So this whole like once a week, we're doing a good thing, aren't we? By talking to our kids about grief when the counselor comes in, right? And bless them for doing it, but it's not enough because the parents don't understand tragedy, trauma, and the brain. You've got your kid for however many hours a day, and then the grief counselor shows up once a week. Where's the benefit? Where does it really help? But we have to keep the pedal to the metal on this issue because the brain is impacted. And if we don't pay attention to the impact on the brain due to grief, we're going to get way behind here with these kids, and we're going to lose more and more ground with their mental health and their intellect. So traumatic loss defaults to the protective survival measures and the defense measures, which means that the brain then goes to fight or flight, which then increases blood pressure and heart rate, which releases hormones. And if you guys in the classroom have noticed, like your kids are kind of spaced out when they're going through grief, their hormones are raging, even as young as 6 and 7. Their blood pressure goes up, their heart rate goes up. Their heart, actually, they can hear it in their throat. Some kids say that they can hear it in their ear, and they have this fight or flight mechanism. So they start scratching back and forth on the paper as they're going through this fight or flight process. And the brain's goal then becomes survival, right? As you're talking and you're standing up there in the front of the class, the brain, due to grief that you had nothing to do with, starts to work in a process. And the process then, because it's a normal process, which is protection, it leads to changes in memory, sleep, behavior, body function, immune systems, heart changes, brain fog, and all of these are normally and largely undetected. It's not fair. It's not fair, you all. Because what happens is these kids, due to grief that is a part of life, death is a part of life. People die, siblings die, parents die, pets die, trees die, trauma happens. And yet these poor kids are going through this basically chemical change in their body due to the brain doing what the brain is supposed to do, but we can't and don't acknowledge it because many instructors understandably treat grief as a need for talk therapy without really understanding that it is a physiological function. So here's what happens. So tragedy affects the brain because it depends on the duration and the degree of the emotional response. So the brain can either strengthen or weaken existing connections. And you all probably know about neuroplasticity, and this is going to be a review for a lot of you. Neuroplasticity is the ability to alter those neural connections, which, forgive my typo, allows the brain to compensate for the loss or other trauma because it forms new neural connections. And this is where music also helps as a powerful way to make new connections. And it helps one to adapt to new situations. But Dr. Schulman wrote beautifully about this, that chronic stress causes a reduction in nerve growth and memory, and it increases fear to help one focus on survival. And the more it happens, the more that it becomes hardwired. That's why you'll see kids that are in observance of trauma, for example, really are, the phrase is stuck. They become stuck in replaying the event because their brains become more and more hardwired to responding to that event, even though it happened a year, 18 months, 2 years ago. I know a 5-year-old little boy who is still stuck in his trauma. He's replaying the message. In fact, he shares almost the same exact message, even though it's been a year and a half after the event, because his brain is becoming hardwired to the fact that this chronic stress has been occurring in his life, and add to it parental alienation. So he feels that he's stuck in between the two air quote sides. And so now his brain is becoming hardwired, which is tragic at only 5 years old. So here's what happens when the circuit fires repeatedly. The grief can disrupt the diverse cognitive domains of memory, decision-making, and some of the other visual spatial function, and also the attention word fluency and the speed of information processing. So as you all are trying to teach and you see these kids get further and further behind, what happens, unfortunately, is that the parents then can become predisposed to seeking behavioral health counseling, when really a lot of it has to do with grief and trauma. Does this make sense to you guys? Old news, maybe? So how do we help children help themselves? This is super important. Here's why. If we can help children help themselves, they really begin to feel empowered rather than victimized. Teaching children to self-soothe through grief is imperative. It is imperative. And I say this with such conviction, but also with great sympathy toward you all, because you have so much on your plates already. If your principal or your administrator isn't dialed into the fact that grief talk is imperative for children, then you're fighting an uphill battle. Children who learn to self-soothe regarding the word grief, and I've taken a straw poll and I've said, how many of you use the word grief? Oh no, we use mindfulness. These kids know they're grieving. They know that they are sad. They know that their dog died, their house washed away in a flood, that a tornado shook their windows, that they're terrified, that their parents are speaking junk about each other through parental alienation. They know that they are sad and feel grief. If we don't use the word, they won't be able to seek out the help. They get it. Unfortunately, our kids are understanding grief. It's just in such degrees that we never thought possible. So learning to self-soothe through grief is important, and because it doesn't eliminate the role of the instructor. It doesn't place burden on the child. It's saying, here's a tool to help you if you feel that you are grieving, if you feel this, here's a tool in your toolbox. And helping them build a toolbox that you can either, for kindergartners, label it mindfulness or draw a picture, whatever works for you in your educational environment, that's important. Also, helping children learn to self-soothe, it empowers the child. They know they're grieving, and it also acknowledges wellness. We have to show them that there is an exit ramp. So telling them that they're on this journey and on this pathway acknowledges what they already know. You know, in death care with dying children, it's really fascinating. And I say this respectfully to these beautiful children. When I talk to them, they'll say, well, I'm dying. And I'm thinking, well, I just left your mom and she said that you don't know, and that you know, not to mention the D word to you. And they say to me, well, Miss Dianne, don't tell my mom I'm dying. But I know, and I don't want her to be sad. And the parent says, hey, don't mention the D word because I don't want them to know, and I don't want them to be sad. And so I try to bring the two together in kind of a kumbaya, respectful moment so they can have this open conversation. Well, it's the same thing with grief. These kids know they're grieving. In fact, I had a 6-year-old stop me the other day and I said, how do you even know that Russia bombed? I mean, the child came up to me, Miss Dianne, did you know that Russia bombed Ukraine this morning in whatever the city was and it was appropriate? I said, how do you even know this? Oh, my papa watches the news every morning and every night. So they also know that other children are grieving around the world. and that people are dying. So in helping them build a toolbox through, as Scarlett said, tapping, havening, mindfulness, meditate, all the things that we'll discuss, it's really powerful. So here's what self-help for children might look like, or how to help yourself if you're grieving. We can help them by better understanding breath work, really simple breath work. Slow down your emotions. Do your emotions, do your feelings. Do your feelings feel fast? Yes. Yes. They feel like they're going really fast. Okay, let's slow them down a little bit and have the class do this. Many of you probably already do this. And also too, do you know that dehydration can amp up their exhaustion and exacerbate their feelings of grief? In a survey that I did with kids, they felt they had dry mouth. Kids that were grieving. You talk to them during their counseling session and they would feel that like, so what's going on? Are you thirsty? Yes. So thirsty. When was the last time you had something to drink? This morning. And you think, oh my goodness. So encouraging body movement. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was, you know, really the iconic figure as part of the grief and grieving movement, suggesting hitting a pillow. She used to use phone books back in the day, in the 60s and 70s. But kids now can run and jump in place and it just gets that energy out. Art, as you know, helps kids draw their emotions, and just getting it out is the purpose. You know, there still is a movement to do art therapy. The thing is, in the classroom, we don't always have access to an art therapist. We're not looking to diagnose kids whose feelings are ordinary grief. The goal is to really, truly help them to feel that grief is normal. Feeling sad is normal after the death of someone, and it's to help them unblock their emotions. Running water, believe it or not, is really helpful. And teaching kids that it's okay to cry when you're in the shower. It's okay to cry when you're in the bath. It might freak them out. But I can tell you from being in this space for 30 years that thousands of people cry in the shower. Do any of you cry in the shower or in the tub? I'm watching the chat box while I'm talking to you. Does anybody grieve or cry in the shower? Yes. I do these talks every week, right? Think of it this way. We come from a watery womb. It's warm. Sometimes it's dark. It feels safe. And in the car, me too, by the way, Kristen. It feels safe. But in this water, what happens is functional MRIs show that it helps to reset and adjust the brain while we are in, on, near, around the water or under the water. So there's a great book by a friend of mine, Jay Nichols, called Blue Mind. If you're into understanding the water, you can teach kids that being in, on, near, around, or under the water is really helpful for them as they try and grieve, as is soft music. And also for kids, it's okay to talk to their friends. I know that some parents and some instructors that are death averse and grief averse may not agree with me on that. I don't want anybody talking to my child about what happened to their lives. We're not teaching kids to be little therapists, okay? We're not. Nobody wants that. I don't want that. But what we want them to do is to be compassionate listeners. So here are the top 5 things when it comes to explaining grief and the process to kids. First of all, I love to show kids a picture of waves and use wave sounds if you have a sound machine, or grab your phone and explain to them that grief and the feeling that comes with grief, that it comes and goes like waves. Most kids at a very early age understand about tides. The tides come in and tides come out, that the ocean brings in waves. We can explain to them, and most adults, by the way, do not even, this is new information for them too. We can explain to them that sometimes the wave comes and it'll knock us down. That's called a grief attack. And kids are like, oh my gosh, there's a grief attack. What does it feel like? It feels like your emotions are really big and we don't know what they're going to have, what to do with them. But we can do things about that grief attack. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But sometimes the waves come and they knock us down, but sometimes we need a minute to prepare because we feel our feelings, and sometimes it gently calms before it gets to the shore. And another thing I explain to kids is that these feelings are not bad, mad, sad, scared. They're normal emotions. But what we do with those feelings, that's what matters in terms of anger toward other children and hitting and punching, etc. We need to learn to help kids make a unique grief plan by talking about it in advance. Grief is a normal part of life. If you think about, my mom's 84, my dad died in December of Alzheimer's, she is grief illiterate. And I say that respectfully, we've talked about it, but this is big. They've been married for 47, 50 years, right? She had no idea how to do grief. Well, these kids are going to be doing grief for the rest of their lives. So helping them to make a unique grief plan based on some things that we're going to talk about is super important. Thank you, Jill. Helping them script it out in advance. I feel X. Well, what can you tell yourself? I am loved. I am safe. I like my friends. I have friends. I love my mommy. My mommy loves me. This is part of a grief plan. What can they tell themselves to get through the moment? And then helping kids understand that they have a grief buddy, whether it's you, whether it's their mommy, whether it's somebody in the classroom, whether it's an intern. A grief buddy is not a therapist. It's what we know in life is that person who just hangs out with us in the space. You want to go to the playground? Yeah. You want to swing on the swings? Sure. Thanks. I'm your grief buddy. You're not alone anymore. Grief shared is grief divided. Grief shared is grief divided, said Rabbi Grolman. Profound statement. So we're going to talk about the love formula. This is intentionally simplified. It is intentional because these are kids. We don't want kids to become little therapists. We want them to learn, to someone else's comment above, we want them to learn to recognize their feelings. Do you know that when I go to these conferences and I listen to the talks, how do we teach children to talk about grief? What do we teach them to say? Da, 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 da. I think it's all wrong. And I say that respectfully because there are some extraordinary counselors in the field, extraordinary. But I really think that the whole conversation starts with listening. Don't speak before you listen. Does that make sense? But here's the basic formula. LOVE. Listen, observe, validate, empathize. And if kids in the kindergarten can't say empathize, they can just say the E word. We need to teach children to ask themselves these questions. What is my own mind saying? Their minds are already talking. When they see somebody, something's off, if they will stop to ask themselves, what's my brain saying? What's my mind saying? What's my heart saying? Because sometimes they're not aligned. What am I hearing my friends say? What am I hearing my classmates say? My frog died. And kids can be really descriptive sometimes. And then the student can say, is that what I really heard? Did I really hear that? Their mommy died, their daddy died, their bicycle was stolen. Somebody broke in their house. Is that what I heard? What is my mind saying? because empowerment starts in the singular child. Remember, this isn't just about the grieving student. You guys have a class full. This is about empowerment. And through empowering students to become grief-centric and grief-aware, we can help them immensely to feel that they are not powerless and they're not victimized. Does that make sense? And I have to tell you too, quite honestly, there are a lot of your kids, if they start practicing it, they're going to be the ones that are teaching their parents, because we live in a largely grief illiterate country. Sad to say. So what is my mind saying? A kindergartner can say to themselves, what's my brain thinking? What's my heart feeling? What's my heart saying? What am I hearing so-and-so say? Oh, is that what I really heard? Because they're thinking it anyway. This just validates what they're thinking. Observe. What are my eyes telling my brain? What are my eyes telling my heart? What am I seeing now? And you can do this as a practice in your classroom, one-to-one. And role play. What am I seeing now? I see somebody sad. I see somebody happy. I see them scared. My eyes are telling me a story. My ears told me a story too. So let's validate those stories. The love formula teaches validation. It's a tool for building connection and empathy while decreasing isolation, which impacts a feeling of well-being. That is intentional. We know, due to much of the work that Scarlett's been doing and others, that isolation impacts mental health. You all know that. You see it every day. This is a slippery slope for kids right now in our country. We want to build connection and empathy. So this formula does that. And so what does validation sound like? I may not be 100% right, but I think I hear what I hear, says the child to himself or herself. And I think I see what I see. Okay. That's validating their own emotions and their own experience. But then we're going to validate with the other person. Are you okay? Are you sad or mad or scared? We're going to validate what we think we see, but we're also going to validate. I heard you say that you're sad or that this happened. We're validating. And we're building community. Super important. We're building connection through validation. You know, there has been great research done in the last 10 years on validation and how when we don't bear witness to another person's grief or tragedy, and that grief is not validated, that it is not healed. And I truly believe that children can help heal each other. Not through therapy, but by validation. I see you. I see your feelings. I see your sadness. I see what's going on here. I may not understand it, and I don't have to, and I can't fix it, but I'm here with you. That's validation. That's it. And there's a period at the end of the sentence. Does that make sense? And the next thing has to do with empathy, because there's a difference between emotional coaching and emotional dismissing. And I bet that you all have seen this quite a bit in some of your parents that you work with. And it's heartbreaking. I saw this the other day. While a parent was talking about empathy to kids, the child said, you know, why is it that when I dropped my drink on the floor, you said, don't be upset? I was upset. And then you told me I should try to understand how other people feel. You know, it's the paradox. The parents on the phone, the parents checking Instagram, the parents checking Facebook, the parents doing work. And meanwhile, the kids, you know, whatever. And they're like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. Get up, get up, get up. Well, the child is sad and has a right to be sad, whatever felt. fell on the floor, whatever broke, whatever happened. But we don't validate that feeling sometimes. And I'm not saying as instructors or in a therapeutic environment, right? But we see it happen with parents all the time. That their emotions are dismissed, kind of like, oof. And that comes from the parents' own stuff that we're not here to talk about today. But just know that there is a difference between emotional coaching and emotional dismissing. And without emotional coaching and with emotional dismissing, validation doesn't matter. So the question becomes then, how can we help create more empathy literate children by becoming more empathy literate ourselves? How many of you have had any training in empathy in your classroom environment? Can you kind of type in a yes or no? Who's had training on empathy? Just so I can sort of tailor this to you. Yes, awesome. Anybody else? Yes, perfect. So I can kind of go through this. Perfect. That's actually very refreshing. So you guys know that it's vital for a cohesive society, and with the lack of empathy, what can happen, and the health outcomes. Cognitive empathy is important. We know that role taking. We see role taking in trauma quite a bit with children, and we see cognitive empathy rising from the age of 13. And that affective empathy really remains relatively high and stable throughout adolescence. When it comes to teaching children about empathy, I hear that my friend is sad, and we can teach them that empathy may mean that we can relate to their feelings. And here's what I use as a metaphor. So here's empathy in this situation, that we can make a decision to be a friend, walk through a situation, much like walking through a doorway. Children of first responders sometimes will have vicarious grief, and therefore a different type of empathy. And it's important to help kids understand that they can be a friend through a situation, like walking through a doorway. They can validate, but they don't have to carry the weight of the grief. In following moments of mindful awareness, the capacity to pivot is the key to emotional wellness. One of my grief clients called me recently, and she was just unhinged. And I said, hey, we had an appointment. What's going on? How are you? And she said, I've had 10 people die this year. And I said, whoa, that's a lot. Okay, let's talk about that. And I said, let's go through it. And she started listing the different people that she feels that she lost that year. A brother, a father, some friends from elementary school, somebody that she knew, an entertainer, and an entertainer that was a celebrity in a public space that she didn't know. But what she did was she was truly empathetic, but she started putting all these people in her backpack. So it got too heavy to carry. And so it's important to also teach children that while we can empathize, it's important to pivot. Okay, we don't have to carry the weight of the loss or of the sadness. We can help them. That validation is the gift, not fixing the problem. Does that make sense? I hope so. Emotional empathy. It's the vicarious experience that I was talking about. And that's when we have the situation where some kids feel that they're living vicarious experiences of another person's emotional state. Like a child who was in observance of his father putting a gun to his head a year and a half ago, pushes repeat in his brain. And he has taken on the exact language of the father on numerous experiences. and the emotional state of the dad at that time. And he's stuck in trauma, and he's also going through another trauma bond. So in that case, emotional empathy is not of help. It's a part of an emotional responsiveness. So if you guys want, take a picture of this. It's really good. And I put the attribution at the bottom. You can use your camera to take a picture of it. Discuss with your children by asking these questions: what empathy is and why it's important. This is really good, this one. What is something that we could do or say that might make someone else feel happy? I don't really like to use the word happy, by the way. Okay. I think it puts the burden on children, and I'm not in favor of that. But feel understood, sure. Feel heard, sure. I just don't use that word a lot. But how do you know if someone is listening? Where do they look, and what is their body doing? That goes to that whole person understanding of what grief is. So use this if it works for you. Here are other empathy statements. You can take a picture of it. It's really good, from Emily Scott. This doesn't feel fair, does it? I can see you were upset. That really hurt, didn't it? It's hard when things don't go our way. And if you guys also have other tips and clues, you can put those in the chat box. That's good too, to help each other out. When children dissociate due to grief or trauma, there can be a possibility that they'll dissociate from their feelings and thus lack empathy. I am seeing that right now. And a young adult who went through childhood trauma. This is why helping children through grief is imperative to their future well-being. It's imperative. And it's scary and it's difficult. And this puts the onus, unfortunately, all too often on the classroom experience. But these kids aren't getting the care they need. And by the way, this isn't just on, parents being disrespectful or not being responsible. I tried to find trauma care for a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old today in a city, and there's a 1-year wait. 1 year. I called everywhere, and I'm a really resourceful person through the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. I can call pretty much anywhere. And let me tell you, the answer was 1 year. In my own county, it's 12 to 14 months to get trauma assessment and trauma care for an elementary school child. It's absurd, much less if the parent can pay for it, even with insurance. So it's not just that parents are being irresponsible and not taking this seriously. It's that once a week care from the hospice, who sends their grief and bereavement people into the school in a good situation, it's not enough for these kids. Children do really well sometimes with EMDR, eye movement desensitization. And yet they can't get the care. They can't get in. They can't be seen. It's exasperating to me. And that's why I think you all are so important. So here's just a quick share on the love formula. The whole goal, the reason that I created this, was so that we can empower children to play an active role in recognizing their own emotions. More than anything, more than helping other people or being a grief buddy or understanding, it's helping them to understand their own emotions. What are they seeing? What are they hearing? What are they processing? How does it impact them? Do their hearts beat faster when they see somebody in grief? Oh, I'm grieving too. This is how I feel. It eliminates and reduces feelings of isolation and loneliness, which can lead to real disruption. And it's not a one-stop process. It's just not. It's a step toward building connection. And we need that as much as possible, especially Scarlett, through your beautiful work. I know you work very hard to build compassion and empathy and more, forgiveness, all of these things. And you all as teachers need as much support as you can get. I love this quote by Rabbi Earl Grolman, because unfortunately in our country, we tend to medicalize grief. And it's heartbreaking for me to see every day that People take their hands off the wheel. Parents, grandparents, neighbors, when it comes to grief. Grief is not a disorder. It's not a disease. It's not an illness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity, and it's the price we pay for love. And the only cure for grief is to grieve. It is a fact. But what happens, unfortunately, is that we feel that we're held accountable for doing grief work, which is actually compassion with people who are grieving, and we send them to a psychiatrist for grief in our country, quite honest. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't other mental health components to all people, and grief is just the sidecar. Of course, that is very natural. I mean, our country's filled with people that have needs for mental health assistance, but grief on its own is not a disorder. Here's some resources for you. They're really good. Articles on empathy, EI games for kids. If we create intelligent kids, that's awesome. I'm a huge fan of bookwork. I'm a math and science nerd myself. But if we don't help kids with their emotional intelligence, we're in trouble. There's also an article in here about empathy and kids and what can happen on the downside, different institutes, and brain loss after grief. And I really want to thank you. It may feel like you're just one person, but I can assure you that the time you invest, that you may just be the world to one person. You really truly make a difference. And then when you make a difference to one child, you're impacting generations. You know, these are my kids, and yes, my son died. He died, and my daughter is still alive. And she is the one who was the recipient of the care and what she observed in terms of death and grief care. And when the person came to our house, did Reiki, she did Reiki on her first. She felt validated that her grief was important. I want to come back to you, Julie, about a grandparent. Does that sound cool? Make sure you back that down. So I want to thank you for tonight's talk. I have some time for Q&A if you want to ask specific questions.